Welcome to the Silica Exposure Training for the cut stone industry. This training covers the identification, evaluation, and control of silica exposures in cut stone and stone fabrication industries. The training was developed by Georgia Tech's Safety, Health, and Environmental Services Group with funding from the U.S. Department of Labor's Susan Harwood Training Grant Program. This is Lesson 6, Personal Protective Equipment and Respiratory Protection for the cut stone industry. Before we dive into a lesson on personal protective equipment and respiratory protection, let's hear from Ever about his experience with respirators and masks.
Bueno, de hecho, máscaras ahí habían para agarrar, pero no eran unas máscaras como que lo protegieran a uno del polvo. Esas máscaras lo protegen como de alguna basurita, de cosas como grandecitas, no de polvo. No son buenas porque siempre el polvo entra, porque es polvo. Y entonces eso fue lo que pasó esa ocasión.
So how do you know what type of personal protective equipment, or PPE, you should wear when working in the cut stone industry? Your employer is required to perform a personal protective equipment hazard assessment that looks at each job at the facility and identifies what hazards may cause injury or illness. Once this task is completed, your employer uses this information to select the appropriate PPE for you to wear. This is an example of a PPE hazard assessment for employees that are performing polishing and sanding at the fabrication shop. If we look at the job of polishing and sanding, some of the hazards an employee might experience include noise from tools, silica dust from polishing and sanding, slips, trips, and falls from water on the floor and injuries to the feet from dropping objects, water on clothing, injury to arms and hands from polishing and sanding, and dust and flying debris. So as a result, the personal protective equipment we might select for this job would include hearing protection, respiratory protection, steel-toed boots that are slip-resistant and rubber, an apron, arm sleeves, gloves, and safety glasses. Now, let's watch as Javier dons his personal protective equipment. He is already wearing his rubber slip-resistant steel-toed boots. First, he puts on nitrile gloves to protect his hands from the water and dust. Next, he secures the arm sleeves to protect the length of his arms. After that, he puts on his respirator and safety glasses. Finally, he puts on his apron to keep himself dry. Notice how, before he gets to work, he performs a user seal check to make sure the respirator is seated properly on his face. We just watched Javier don his PPE, but he was missing one important piece of equipment. Instead of wearing hearing protection, he had a Bluetooth headset in his ear. This is a common problem, and let's show you why. In this video, we are using a sound level meter to measure how loud it is when employees perform grinding, sanding, and polishing on stone countertops. Work-related hearing loss can occur when an employee is exposed to noise above 85 decibels over the course of an 8-hour work shift. And OSHA requires that hearing protection be worn when noise is above 90 decibels for an 8-hour work shift. For this task, the noise levels reached 99 decibels, and they were consistently hovering well over 95 decibels. What this means is that if you are wearing a Bluetooth earpiece or some other form of a device to listen to music while you work, not only are your ears being exposed to the noise from the tools, but they are also being exposed to the sound waves from the music you are listening to. And all too often, we discover that employees turn the music up higher than the noise from the tools to be able to hear the music, meaning in this case, the employee might be listening to music above 100 decibels. At 100 decibels, it will only take 15 minutes to reach 100% of a person's total amount of noise they can be exposed to during the day, or the dose before causing permanent damage to their ears. There are several different types of respirators or masks that can be used to protect you from silica dust. Your employer should first conduct air sampling to determine how much silica dust is in the air. Using those results, your employer may select either a dust mask or N95 respirator, which is also called a particulate filtering facepiece. This type of respirator should only be used once and thrown out at the end of the day. Or your employer may select a respirator that either covers half the face and has cartridges attached, which is called a half-mask elastomeric respirator, or any number of other types of respirators, some of which also provide eye protection. Half-mask respirators and N95 dust masks are both negative pressure and tight-fitting, which means that the following things have to happen. Number 1, your employer should either provide you with what is called Appendix C of the respirator standard, which is like a survey you fill out to see if you're healthy enough to wear a respirator, or send you to a healthcare provider to check your lungs. 2, you should be fit tested, which is a test that is performed to make sure that the respirator fits well enough so that no silica dust gets into your lungs. And 3, you need to be clean shaven. Facial hair prevents respirators from keeping silica dust out. When employees are required to wear respirators, employers must comply with all elements of a respiratory protection program. Employers are also responsible for designating a program administrator who must ensure that the appropriate respirator is selected. Employees have been medically evaluated before being allowed to wear a respirator. Employees have been fit tested. Employees have been trained about the maintenance, care, and use of the respirator, and that they annually evaluate the program. To help companies develop a respiratory protection program, we have downloadable sample-written programs on our website at oshainfo.gatech.edu/resources/. If your employer requires you to wear a respirator, you should be provided with a medical evaluation. This is different than the silica medical surveillance, which we will talk about in another lesson. Here are some important things to know about the respiratory protection medical evaluation. Number 1, the employer has to provide this at no cost to the employee. It must be kept confidential and provided during the employee's normal working hours or at a time and place convenient to the employee. Number 2, the medical questionnaire needs to be provided in a way that the employee understands. The employer should give the employee an opportunity to discuss the questionnaire and examination results, and this should be provided in a language the employee understands. Medical evaluations are not required when N95s are voluntarily used. The employer must provide the physician or licensed healthcare professional with a copy of the silica standard, the description of the anticipated duties as they relate to silica exposure, former, current, and anticipated levels of exposure to silica for each employee, personal protective equipment used by employees, and all previous medical examinations in control of the employer. This is to help the physician or licensed healthcare professional to understand what physical activity or tasks employees have to do as part of their jobs, so that the licensed healthcare provider can determine if the employee's body can handle wearing a respirator for the entire work shift. Employees who have been medically cleared to wear a respirator by the physician or licensed healthcare provider can now be fit tested using the type of respirator they will be working with. Employees must be fit tested prior to the initial use of the respirator and then annually after that. Fit testing must also occur whenever a different type of respirator is being used, when the physical appearance of the employee changes, or when an employee indicates that the current fit of the respirator is poor. What this means for you is that if you notice dust getting into the respirator, You need to let your employer know so that they can help you find a respirator that fits properly and will protect you. One way to make sure your respirator fits properly is to perform a user seal check every time you put the respirator on. To do this, put the respirator on, cover the part of the respirator that allows the air to get out, called the exhalation valve, or the entire mask if it is an N95 respirator. Then try to breathe out. If you feel air leaking out, then you know you need to adjust the respirator. Then cover the part of the mask where the air comes in, called the inhalation valves, or for the entire mask if it is an N95. Now breathe in. The mask should get tighter on your face, but if you feel air leaking in, then again, you need to adjust the respirator. Respiratory protection training must be provided annually to employees who are part of the respiratory protection program. Training should include the procedures for selecting appropriate respirators, medical evaluations for respirator users, fit test procedures for tight-fitting respirators, procedures for proper routine or emergency use respirators, cleaning, storing, inspecting, repairing, and maintenance of respirators, ensuring adequate quality, quantity, and flow of breathing air, respiratory hazards to which employees are exposed, and how to wear, use, and care for their respirators. One of the problems we see when we inspect countertop fabrication facilities is that respiratory protection is not maintained and cared for properly. In this image, you can see a half-mask elastomeric respirator hanging off a cart. This is a problem because it will ruin the elastic on the straps, preventing a secure fit, and it leaves the inside of the mask exposed to any silica dust that is in the air and may settle inside the mask. What this means is that when the employee puts the mask on, they may immediately breathe in any dust that had settled into the mask. This is why proper maintenance and care is so important to prevent exposure to silica dust. What needs to happen is, 1, each day at the end of the shift, respirators, if they are reusable, should be cleaned and inspected during the cleaning for any damage. 2, after the respirator is cleaned, it should be stored in a manner to prevent damage and contamination. 3, during the shift, when respiratory protection is not required, the respirator should be stored in a clean location, like a plastic bin, bag, or toolbox to keep it clean and prevent contamination when not in use. And 4, if you're using an N95 dust mask, keep in mind that these masks are considered single-use respirators and should be thrown out at the end of each shift. Thank you for watching Lesson 6 of the Silica Exposure Training for the cut stone industry, a training on the identification, evaluation, and control of silica exposures in the cut stone and stone fabrication industries. This material was produced under grant number SH37200 SH1 from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, U.S. Department of Labor. It does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the U.S. Department of Labor, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial products, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government.